every Wednesday is a great day for studying about the middle game, because Wednesday middle game show with me. So thank you for being here. Thank you for studying with me. I think that now you can see the board. This game we have already seen in a previous session, because today we are learning about how to play against the isolated pawn, and I wanted to tell you that you already know how to play against the hanging pawns. And since these structures, the isolated pawn and the hanging pawns, are very similar, sometimes they can transpose to one another. You have already seen some model games for playing against the isolated pawn without knowing that it was isolated pawn, because this position, for instance, it was in the Portish-Karpov game that we have already studied. And here, black went for bishop takes c3, b takes. So this is how we reach the hanging pawn structure. These are the hanging pawns, and we know how to play against the isolated. We know how to play against the hanging pawns. So try to remember what you have learned about the hanging pawns. If you haven't seen that session, you can watch it on YouTube or on our shows page. Please check it out, because many times with black playing against the isolated pawn, you have the chance of capturing on c3, and then what you need to know are the ideas on how to play against the hanging pawns, because suddenly the structure has changed. You need to know how to play against those two pawns, c3, d4, or c4, d4 pawns. Please check that video, that lesson, because it will be very useful on how to play against the isolated pawn. But today we will see some more ideas, because sometimes it's gonna be like the hanging pawns, and sometimes there are other plans. That's what we're gonna do today. We will see some maneuvers, some ideas, how to defend our king, how to protect it better, how to trade pieces, and what maneuvers you can carry out in order to improve your pieces. Before we begin, let me just copy you the link for the training tournament of today, because you can already sign up for the thematic tournament with my live commentary. Please sign up, make sure that you will be there. We will practice everything that we learned today. So first we learn, then we practice at 8:30 training tournament with me, commentating live on your games. Let me copy it to the chat and we begin. This is where you can sign up. Please click on this link in the chat and make sure you sign up for the training tournament. It's part of the show. First we study, then we practice. And it will be, once again, with my live commentary. I will be here watching your games, seeing what you do well, giving you advice. It's very personal, so I think it's quite useful to take part of this tournament so that you can know what I think about your play, how can you improve your chess. That's enough for the thematic tournament advertisement. I think now you already know that you should sign up. I'll be here at 8:30 Central European Time. That's in 2 hours and 15 minutes. But in order to play well in that tournament, we should study a lot today. And we will begin with, once again, a Karpov game, because Karpov has a really nice model games playing against the hanging pawns and the isolated pawns. He's in general very good in exploiting structural weaknesses, and the isolated pawn is a structural weakness. So we have seen that white has a lot of activity for having the isolated pawn, but if black can trade pieces, if black can get into an endgame, then that pawn will be weak. It doesn't have any support. It's only protected by other pieces. No pawn is supporting it. That's why it's an isolated pawn. So we will see how to make this pawn weak. This is the Caro-Kann defense and how to enter in the isolated pawn structure. Well, the Panov attack is what white plays against the Caro-Kann. So this is how we will reach the isolated pawn. It's already there on d4. You can see it. I'll color it just in case. That guy, the isolated pawn. We know how to play with it, but now focus on black's play. We are playing with the black pieces. This is all theory, so we are not discussing this part. But from here on, after knight f6, you will soon see every step, every move counts. For instance, here, this is the first very important moment. White has just played knight e4. And you can ask, what's going on with that d4 pawn? Isn't that hanging? Is the d4 pawn hanging? Can we capture that pawn? Think about knight takes d4 in this position and tell me if you would capture that pawn or not. And for this case, I have this beautiful time to think image so that I'm not bothering with my stupid facial expressions. You can take your time and think about this position. The question is whether we should or we should not capture the pawn on d4. Knight takes d4. So guys, shall we capture this pawn on d4 or we better not capture it? What do you think? Some of you are saying, yes, let's take the pawn. Others are voting for no. We better not capture the pawn. I'll bring back the camera and discuss it with you guys because it's not so easy to decide. It's tempting to capture the pawn. This is our strategy. Actually, this is our goal, to make that pawn weak and then capture it. So when we are playing against the eyes of that pawn, we want to capture that pawn, but careful. It does matter when we capture it. This is a position with loads of pieces on the board. That means that after capturing, let me show you. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes. This is what you have calculated. White can continue with bishop c3. We have to move the queen. And then he brings his rook as well. What is his threat? Well, he's threatening knight takes f6 check, and then bishop h7 would win our queen. So once again, we have to do something about the queen. We can trade pieces on e4 and then move the queen. But still, look at White's bishops. The c3 bishop, the e4 bishop, and the rook is about to come to the king side. Also, the queen is so close. So White has a lot of compensation for the pawn, lots of initiative, while Black is undeveloped. Our bishop is on c8, our rook is on a8. So we have captured the pawn, we are a pawn up, but on the other hand, White has a lot of attack. And you don't want to be suffering trying to defend this position because White is better. It's not a decisive advantage. It's not like it's mate immediately, but White's position is much better. He has a lot of initiative, and we will have to protect our king instead of developing those queenside pieces. So no, we better not capture the pawn. Let's go back to this critical moment because here after 94, it's just so tempting to capture the pawn. I know. And if we calculate, it's just like, okay, why not capture the pawn? We are not losing the queen. That's true. But sometimes what we lose by capturing a pawn is not material, but time. And time matters so much in the attack. So White doesn't mind giving up a pawn for gaining time for his attack. Everything comes with a tempo. Bishop c3 is a tempo. Then rook d1 is a tempo. White is always threatening something, so everything goes with the initiative. This is what White wants. Let's not enter his play. Let's not do this. Let's not capture the pawn because this is exactly what White wants. He doesn't care about the pawn, but what he cares about is the attack. So now he's threatening rook g3, rook h3, everything. This is a bad position for black. Therefore, after knight e4, we will not capture the pawn. What we want to do first is finish our development. So Karpov instead went for queen b6. The queen will be very well placed on b6 because it is still attacking the d4 pawn, but it gives up the d8 square for the rook. The rook can come to d8 later. And also we will develop the bishop. We want to go bishop d7 afterwards. You'll soon see what I'm talking about. And just to add, the queen from b6 is attacking the b2 pawn. It's more than obvious, but just like with the d4 pawn, you have to be careful about capturing pawns on b2, d4 when the board is full of pieces and we are undeveloped. So in this position, I think I already gave you a hint on what I mean about queen takes b2. After a3, would you capture on b2 in this position with black, or would you capture on d4? I think the d4 capture we all understand by now, but what about this b2 pawn? Would you capture it? Okay, I see that I cannot trick you guys. It is, of course, a pawn that is not protected. We could capture it, but once again, what we would lose is a lot of time. Even if our queen manages to escape, well, probably not, but even if we manage to get out of b2 with the queen, this is usually a poisoned pawn. It's called a poisoned pawn in many variations because, as I said, even if you don't lose the queen, what you lose is time. White will get a lot of tempi just by attacking the queen, just by threatening to trap the queen. So let's not go for pawns like this unless you calculated that it will work out well for you. We are undeveloped. We shouldn't go and capture pawns. What we should do is finish development. Let me just demonstrate why we shouldn't capture on b2. As I said, your queen might get trapped. And here that is the case. Even if it didn't get trapped, it would be a bad move to capture on b2. But here, after knight f6, bishop takes, queen e4, threatening mate on h7, g6, and rook f b1, the queen is indeed trapped. Oof, that's bad. Actually, it worked with the other move order too. After queen b2, you can go first rook b1, but then you have to deal with this knight takes d4 move, and actually the solution is the same as in the previous line. We capture with check on f6, and then queen e4 threatens mate on h7, and the queen on b2 is hanging too. So black is losing his queen. As I said, you better not capture on b2 in a position that's full of pieces and we are undeveloped. When you haven't finished development, just try to avoid the temptation of grabbing pawns because to capture a pawn takes time and you need to use that time to develop your pieces. So first we develop our pieces, then we see if we can capture on d4 or on b2. That's why after a3, the good move is bishop d7. That's where the bishop should go. It seems to be a bit passive, but soon you will see that we can regroup our pieces and we will have a better square for that bishop. In a few moves, you'll see. Rook fd1 was played in the game, rook ad1 was another possibility. It depends on how white wants to place his rooks. It's not so easy to decide whether you bring that rook or the other because you might want to have a rook on the c file. You want to have one for sure on the d file, and you might want to have another on the e file, but we don't have three rooks, so you need to decide which two files to take with the white rooks. So Kamsky went for rook fd1, and after rook a d8, actually that's the most precise move in this position, and not the other rook, not rook fd8. It's not a bad move right now. But a few moves later, you might get into trouble because of that f7 pawn. in many positions when we saw how to attack with the isolated pawn, the f7 square was really vulnerable. So if you can keep the rook on f8 until you manage to trade pieces, it's better because you need to have everything well protected around your king, and the f7 square can only be protected by the f8 rook and the king on g8, but the king in itself is not enough. So I know it looks a bit passive to have a rook on f8, but until we don't manage to trade pieces or to create counterplay, we better keep that rook there, believe me. After knight f6, because white has to do something, bishop f6, queen e4. This is the standard plan with white. Queen bishop battery on the b1 h7 diagonal, threatening mate on h7. This is all what we learned with white. So white is doing fine, trying to give mate, but of course we will not let him. And after g6, you see that this bishop on f6 is really useful actually. So we have the possibility of placing this bishop on g7. That would be a fianchetto bishop. And that means that after g6, you know that this push weakens the dark squares. But with the bishop on f6, this is not a big deal because we have a bishop that protects those squares. That's why it's better to have the bishop on f6 and g7 and not on e7. So this maneuver is really useful, placing the bishop on f6 and then g7. Bishop e3 was played in the game, and you need to tell me what is the threat. But before we go for thinking about this position and what is white threatening, we should definitely check what would have happened if after g6 white went for bishop h6, because I told you that whenever g6 happens on the board, we will almost always with white go for bishop h6 because we want to explode the weakness on the dark squares. We want to attack on the dark squares. So what about bishop h6? How would you react to this move? What shall we do here with black? Let's see what you are saying about this position, whether you would move the bishop to g7 or play rook f e8 or none of these moves. Let's see, bishop g7, rook f e8, or maybe knight takes d4. I'll bring the camera back and discuss this position with you guys. Actually, this is a position where it depends on your style and taste which move you pick, because none of them are bad actually. I would suggest bishop g7 because what we have learned is that we should try to trade pieces. And even though after exchanging this bishop the dark squares will be weak, we can go for this move, f6. This is vital. It doesn't matter whether white takes on g7 here or later. Like after queen h4, he's threatening to play knight g5, then capture on g7, and queen takes h7. That's a big threat. But luckily, we always have this move f6. And this is a move you should learn because when you are under attack, you need to protect some vital squares. And here the g5 square is so important. That's where the knight was heading. After knight g5, we would be in big trouble. So we shouldn't let the opponent play knight g5. We need to keep that square under control. And even if f6 looks like it weakens our king, in fact, it protects it because it doesn't let the knight jump to g5. Also in this position, it's the d3 bishop as well that is not doing so much after g6. So we have managed to play against the f3 knight and against the d3 bishop, and we are exchanging this bishop. So bishop g7, king g7. You can see that this king, even though we have pushed g6 and f6, it is a pretty safe king because the remaining pieces, this bishop on d3 and the knight on f3, cannot really access our king. For instance, what white would love to do in this position is somehow push this bishop to e3 and make it a dark squared bishop, but you can't. So even though the dark squares are weak here, we have swapped that bishop, we exchange it for our dark squared bishop, and then there is no other piece that could explode it. We don't let the knight come to g5, and the light square bishop can't do anything about the h6 square. So this is quite a safe position. As you can see by the arrows, we are planning to play knight e7, and the knight from there can jump to f5 or to d5. And the other advantage of playing knight e7 is that we free the c6 square for the bishop. So knight e7 is a really cool maneuver that you should learn playing against the isolated pawn. You will see it in the game as well, actually. I love this maneuver because it's a two-in-one. It will improve the knight and it will improve the bishop as well. So this is an okay position for black. No problems at all about the king. Actually, you could also sacrifice the exchange if you want with knight d4. This is a really complicated position. It would be bishop f8, king f8 or rook f8. And we have a piece and a pawn for the rook and pair of bishops as well. That's important. So it's complicated. Now black is threatening to play bishop c6 and then capture on f3. Also the b2 pawn can fall. I will put it in red. So this, if you like sacrificing, you can give up the exchange. I would prefer to keep the rook and just play simple chess, bishop g7, then protect the dark squares with f6 and carry out this knight e7 knight maneuver. But let's see the game because this maneuver will happen in the game as well. After g6, white played bishop e3, and you should tell me what is the threat. What is white threatening in this position? I think you are all shouting the right move, d5. Actually, the idea is d5, but there is a more precise way of carrying out that plan. White wants to win a piece by pushing d5, but if you go d5 first, after e takes d5, the white queen would be hanging too. Anyway, it's possible to play that, or d5 queen b2, you have to calculate that, but there's a much more simple way of playing d5, playing for the d5 push. So whether we play d5 first and calculate all those lines, d5 is a good move. I'm not saying it's not a good move, but it's even more simple. Let's just play, I need to show it somehow, so I play a6. Okay, let's blunder with black. This is what you should not do, but we will see why not. Uh, d5 is a good move. but you need to count what happens if e takes d5, what happens if queen takes b2. Anyway, it's of course a good move and it's winning material. But it's when you have the choice between playing one move order or the other, check which one is more forced. If you go first, queen f4, you threaten this bishop on f6. It has to go somewhere. And then we play d5. So it means that there's no e takes d5 threatening our queen. And now queen b2 just simply doesn't make much sense because we captured this knight anyway. So that's just a simple piece up. When we go d5 first, you have to calculate what happens if e takes d5. Now our queen is hanging. I know it's winning. I'm not saying that it was a bad move. We can go bishop b6, then doesn't matter that our queen is hanging too, we capture the rook. But you have to calculate all this. So when you have the choice between one complicated variation and one very simple one, pick always the more simple one because it just doesn't give you the chance to make a mistake when you choose the more simple solution. Both of them have the same idea, to push d5 and win a piece. But one has a lot of possible responses. If we go d5, there's e takes d5, there's queen takes b2. While if we go queen f4 first, we restrict the opponent's options. So all I'm saying in general, not about this position, d5 was a good move. So congratulations to everyone who have seen it. But in general, try to always play the more forced line, the more simple one, so that you always make sure that you are not missing anything. Because sometimes when we enter in complications, captures, we might lose control of our calculation. And if we just play simple chess, queen f4, threatening the bishop, and after that we play d5, there's nothing to blunder because the queen is hanging, the knight is hanging on c6. Black just has no response. So the more simple, the better in chess, I believe. But that's just my advice. If you don't like my advice, you have the right, you have the choice to not play like this. I prefer that you pick always the more simple solution, the one that you can clearly calculate. Anyway, after bishop e3, of course we will not blunder. So what to do against this d5 threat? How shall we continue with our plan with black and at the same time prevent the opponent's idea? I've already told you that there's a maneuver that's a 2-in-1 that improves two pieces at the same time. So let's see if we can carry out that maneuver, for instance, now. This was really quick. You guys are so fast today. Yes, of course, we should carry out our knight maneuver, which is knight e7. This is what we have learned. This is what you should learn for today, that this knight from c6 goes to e7. And from there, we can jump to d5 or to f5, and we free the c6 square for the bishop. So compare the position, how we have the pieces here. This d7 bishop is a really sad piece. It doesn't have any perspectives. It cannot go, well, it can go to c8 and it can go to e8, but what for? It would be just so passive. So the bishop on d7 is not good. It doesn't have any diagonals. But after knight e7, suddenly it has a future. We can play bishop c6, attacking the queen on e4, or we can go bishop b5, exchanging the d3 bishop, or we can go bishop a4, attacking the d1 rook. Suddenly we have quite many options for that bishop, and also we are improving the knight because the knight can go to d5. You know that this square is really important when playing against the isolated pawn. That is a square that white can never control. There is no c pawn, there's no e pawn, so whatever we place on d5, usually a knight, white cannot kick that piece away from d5 because there's just no pawn on the c file nor on the e file. That's by this is the nature of the position. There's the isolated pawn on d4, and the square right in front of the pawn on d5 is an outpost for black's pieces. So we love the d5 square for black. It's the great square, central square, so perfect outpost for the knight. But also we can go to f5 because whether you want to block the pawn with knight d5 or if we go knight f5, then we are attacking the isolated pawn. So both of these moves have an advantage. The point is that you should carry out this maneuver, knight e7 and then knight e5 or knight f5. But let's see the game, what happened in the game. If white goes knight after knight e7, if white goes queen f4 trying to play for the same trick, well, first of all, there's no hanging c6 knight anymore, so pointless. But anyway, after queen f4, our bishop is hanging, but we simply go knight d5, attacking and defending at the same time. That's the best. If you can play moves that attack and defend at the same time, instead of just defending and defending and defending, try to defend and attack at the same time. So knight d5 is a perfect example of a move that protects a piece but at the same time attacks another. So the queen is hanging, the queen has to go somewhere. And after queen h6, for instance, we could simply capture on e3. And suddenly, in this position, queen b2 would make sense because why is it possible to capture the pawn here and not in the previous position, in the position where we were thinking about queen takes b2? What's the difference? What have happened since? Many things have happened. Black has, first of all, developed all his pieces. So when you have your pieces developed, okay, I know that the f8 rook is still where it was before, but we have castled, and that rook is protecting the king. So it's not an unemployed piece. The f8 rook is cool. Black has developed all its pieces, so that's a good reason to go and capture pawns. And secondly, our queen won't be trapped. That's also very important to make sure that when you capture on b2, our queen won't just get stuck on b2, but it will have a way out. So after queen b2, doesn't matter that our queen can be attacked. We will capture on a3 as well. And after rook b7, okay, white has regained one pawn and he has this rook on the 7th rank, but suddenly it will be black who will attack. Let me show you how. Bishop c6, and after rook b1, we can capture on f3, g takes, and now e5. Look at the position. Look at the difference between the two kings. It was white who wanted to attack black's king, but suddenly white's king is much worse. Look at the pawn structure in front of white's king, and look at his pieces too. I marked the king in red and also the bishop on d3 because there's a very annoying pin on the d file. So after e5, white cannot capture on e5 because everything will be hanging. The d3 bishop will be in the air. And if he cannot capture on e5, then we will capture on d4, win a pawn, give a check. Suddenly his position will collapse. And the queen is very good on a3. So we didn't just capture the pawn on b2 for the sake of the pawn. Okay, it's a pawn up. But also the queen is attacking from the queen side towards the king side. So it's a very good piece on a3. You can see that the rook on d8, the bishop on f6, and the queen on a3 are all attacking. And it is suddenly white who has to defend. And that's all because white made a few silly moves like queen f4. This is not the game. Kamsky didn't play queen f4, of course, but I just want to show you that the position can collapse so easily if white doesn't pay attention, just because we have carried out this knight maneuver, we capture on e3 in the right moment, then we capture the pawn because we have developed our pieces and our queen is not getting trapped. So let me just show you once again this position. You should remember that you can reach positions like this when you play well against the isolated pawn just because we have carried out this knight maneuver, we placed our pieces well, we developed our pieces, and then we went on to capture pawns. So first we develop, then we grab material. That's the general advice. White played knight e5, of course that's where the knight belongs. But after knight f5, we go to f5 because, well, I told you that we could play knight d5 as well. It's a nice square for the knight. But there's no active plan connected to knight d5. While after knight f5, look at those arrows. The d4 pawn is always a problem for white because if there's no mate, that pawn is a weakness. You know that it's a structural weakness. So black will eventually play for that weakness. We want to capture it. We want to attack that pawn. If we move the bishop, if we move bishop c6, bishop b5, or bishop a4, the rook from d8 will be attacking the pawn on d4 as well. So the more pieces, the better. We have the f5 knight, the queen on b6, the rook on d8, and in some positions, the f6 bishop 2 can be attacking the pawn on d4. So it's getting really tough for white to do something. It's actually already a position where black is better. And we haven't done much. All we did was a knight maneuver and not being greedy too early. So we developed our pieces and then carried out this maneuver. This is what you should learn from the game. After knight c4, Karpov went for queen a6 because if the knight goes back, let me just show you, we have this move, bishop b5, and you know that in general, playing against the isolated pawn, we want to trade pieces, so bishop b5 is a move that favors black. Also, you know that I was emphasizing so much that this is an important piece in the attack for white, so if we can eliminate that bishop, that will be painful for white, believe me. We want to exchange that bishop. If we can, we will exchange it. So queen a6 is a good move because it prepares bishop b5. Also, of course, you could go to b3 as well with the queen. Just make sure that you don't blunder it. So there's knight a5, queen a4. Just make sure that you always have a free square for the queen. That's all. You have to calculate a bit, but once you make sure that your queen is not getting trapped, it's okay to play queen a6 and then bishop b5. a4 prevents bishop b5, but doesn't matter. We will play bishop c6. That's a very good square for the bishop, and it's a tempo. The queen has to go. Queen f4, and now bishop d5. I told you about the d5 square, and in general, it's a cool square for any piece. Many times it's the knight, but now the bishop on d5 is a king. I mean, not literally a king, but it's a cool piece. It is a bishop that used to be on d7, not doing anything. Compare this position to, let me go back, this position. How passive this bishop used to be. And suddenly it's like the most powerful piece black has. Bishop d5, look at this position. The bishop attacks at the same time on both flanks. From d5 it controls a lot of squares. On the king side, on the queen side, in white's camp, in black's camp. So this is a perfect place for the bishop, and we are threatening to capture on c4. That's the immediate threat, of course. So white has to do something about the knight. He went knight e5, but now after queen b6, there's no more knight c4. And, well, it's not so easy to decide what to do here with white. He went for bishop f5. If he goes g4, thinking that he's winning a piece, because if we move the knight, then our bishop is hanging on f6. But of course, Karpov had foreseen all this, and he was planning to meet g4 with g5. After which, it's not just that we are not losing a piece, but it's that we have trapped white's queen. Look at this position. The white queen cannot move. That's just so sad. White wanted to attack, and suddenly his queen gets trapped on f4. Like, is that a joke? No, it's not a joke. It's the position. So white cannot go g4. After queen b6, white doesn't really have any active plan. He went for bishop f5. But anyway, after e takes, and this is very important, of course we will not go g takes because that's what white wants. White wants to weaken our queen. White wants to weaken our king, so we will never capture with the g pawn. That would mean that we open the g file and we expose our own king. No, 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 never. Of course we will capture on f5 with e pawn. And after this, what you see is that we have the pair of bishops. Okay, that's cool. Doesn't really matter much in this position, but okay, we can say it. And after e takes f5, it's true that we have doubled pawns, but actually in this position, having doubled pawns on f7 and on f5 is an advantage to protect our king, because the more pawns are there in front of our king, the better. And now it's just really, really difficult to imagine that white could attack black's king. So it's a very, very safe position for black. The king side is very safe. And suddenly white will have to worry even more about his pawns. The d4 pawn is weak and the b2 pawn is weak. So if he's not careful, we will just capture those pawns and win because we have a pawn or two advantage. Rook d2, defending the pawn, of course. But after bishop g7, well, bishop g7 or rook f8, both moves are good. It will transpose to the game, actually, because after h4, Karpov played rook f8. So all the black pieces are developed. All of them are well placed. The d5 bishop is still, I would say, the most powerful piece in this position. So cool. I wish I could have a piece like that in all my games. And in general, the problem for white is that his pawn structure is weak. So he cannot just sit back and wait for an endgame because he would lose every endgame. Therefore, he should try to attack. But there's not much to attack here. He pushed h4, trying to play h5, and we should see what happens after h5. But do you think this attack is dangerous? Do you think that h5 will create huge problems for black? Does it look like we are getting mated? Let me know about your opinion. Let's see, how would you react to h5? Actually, we should discuss this move, of course. In a game, what would you do after h5? Very good. The answer to the question if it's dangerous, it's no, and with capital letters too. Thank you, guys. This is not dangerous, but still we should do something about this pawn. I mean, first of all, would you want to capture the pawn on h5? G takes h5. Anyone would play g takes h5? Of course not. Thank you, guys. Secondly, are we afraid of h6? This push, the pawn going to h6? Or are we afraid of h6, g6? Yes, you guys are right that it's not very dangerous. Actually, it is not dangerous, but white has to do something. So white is trying to create some attack on the king side because he has to. He cannot just wait until he needs to resign in an endgame. So he's trying to attack black's king, but it's not a dangerous attack at all. Still, there is this annoying piece that white has, and it's called the e5 knight. That's the best piece white has. So whenever the opponent has a good piece, we either want to exchange it, that would mean eliminate it, or chase it away. So what would you do about the e5 knight in this position? We don't care about the h5 pawn. We discussed that it's not dangerous. We let it be there. We will not capture on h5, of course, but we will not do anything about the pawn. Doesn't matter. It's not a big threat. But what we want to do is something against the e5 knight. So whether we should eliminate it or chase it away. Which one would you pick? You are all saying f6, and that's the right move. Of course, we want the knight to leave this e5 square because the knight is very strong on e5. It's a cool piece in the center. You know that you should have your knight in the center, but we don't want to give up the bishop for the e5 knight because this knight is a strong knight, but our bishop is more important. Whenever you have this fianchetto structure, I will mark it in yellow this time, the dark squares are weak. So if you push g6, you know that it has weakened the dark squares around your king. So without the bishop on g7, those squares that I have just colored in red would be very weak. Don't give up the bishop because that would mean that suddenly our king would be really weak because look at those holes in our position. There they are. And on top of that, the white queen is coming to h6, the bishop can come to g5, f6, and suddenly we would be mated. So that bishop, the fianchetto bishop, is so important. Don't give it up. Just no, no, no. After h5, of course, we don't want to have that knight on e5, and what we would do is what you guys said. So congratulations to all of you. The right move was f6. We will just chase the knight away. And after f6, it's not only that the knight had to leave this great square on e5, but it had opened the e file for a rook. And after rook e4, who is attacking here, white or black? Of course, that is not white, it's black. He couldn't even go queen g3 because after queen g3, there's rook g4, and we are already winning. So suddenly the position is so dangerous for white. After rook e4, he has to go queen h2, and now we can simply play g5 because we are threatening f4. That would win a piece. And we also just don't care about this h-pawn because, yes, he could play h6, but that's not a big deal. First of all, we can win the pawn with rook h4, and secondly, that pawn in itself wouldn't win the game. But after g5, the point is that it is black who is attacking, and f4 is a big threat, rook h4 is another threat, rook g4 can be played as well. So suddenly, white is just really, really suffering. That's why h5 was not a good move. Kamsky went for queen g3. But after rook c8, Karpov takes the c file. Of course, that's the open file, and he wants to have his rooks on the open file. Knight d7. Well, we could once again say that, yeah, what happens if h5, but you all told me that it's not a big deal, it's not dangerous, so we can simply just continue our plan on the queen side, queen b3, and we will play rook c2. We don't care about that pawn on h5. Our king is very safe, and nothing will happen after h6, h6. You see that those pawns, those three pawns, are protecting very well the black king, and we can go for rook c2, play on the queen side. That's where the weak pawns are, the d4 pawn, the b2 pawn, the a4 pawn. Those pawns are weak, so we are playing on the queen side. We have our king very well protected, and that's important, but there's nothing going on against our king, so it's very safe. Everything is very safe. Rook c8, knight d7 is what happened in the game, and after queen c6, knight c5, b6. Once again, Karpov chases away the good piece of white because this knight on c5 was blocking our way on the c file. And after queen d7, you will see that a5, rook e4. He went for the same idea. This g2 pawn is weak, and how to access this g2 pawn, the d5 bishop was already attacking the pawn, and now we are playing for rook e4, rook g4. So it is black who is controlling both flanks. We have the rook on the c file, we have a lot of weak pawns on the queen side. I mean, white has a lot of weaknesses on the queen side, and at the same time we are playing on the king side too, because this d5 bishop can play on both flanks. So this is the great thing about the d5 bishop, that we can attack both on the king side and on the queen side. Rook e4 is a big threat, going for rook g4. So knight f4 had to be played. And now my question is, do we care about knight takes d5 or we don't? This is actually not something so easy to understand. After knight f4, white could capture on d5 if we let him. Do we want to let him or not? What is important in this position? Keeping the pair of bishops or keeping the d5 square? Because if we move the bishop away from d5, we have to think about the d5 push, because this bishop is blocking the d pawn. So you know that this d4 pawn is weak, but at the same time it's a passed pawn. So if we move the bishop away, we give the chance to white to push the pawn to d5, and suddenly it might be pushed even to d6. Do we want to let the opponent advance the d pawn? That's when we keep the bishop, or we care more about keeping the control of the d5 square and not the bishop. I hope that my question made sense to you guys. What I mean is that we keep the bishop on d5, we let white capture it on d5, In that case, we will have a queen on d5, or we want to keep the bishop badly, so we move it to b7, let's say, and we let the opponent push d5. What do you think is more important? Blocking the pawn and keeping the d5 square, or keeping the bishop? I'm so proud of you guys. I thought that this was a difficult question because when you have the pair of bishops, you usually want to keep it. Especially here, you see that this d5 bishop is so powerful. So I really thought that you would say that you want to keep the bishop. But the right answer was that what is really important is that we block the d5 square. So even if we have to give up the bishop, we need to control the d5 square. So yes, we will let white capture on d5, because after knight takes d5 we will have our queen on d5, and suddenly, well, we will have no bishop, but we will have the queen on such a powerful square on d5. It will be a very strong piece. So let's not be sad about the bishop. It doesn't matter if suddenly we won't have the pair of bishops, but what really matters here is the control of the light squares, and especially the control of the d5 square. So congratulations to everyone. You all said that we have to keep this d5 square under control, even if it means that we should give up the bishop. Let's just see an example. b5 was played in the game, and if white captures on d5, queen takes, this is what you said. Look at the position. Look at all those pieces that I have colored. It's because the d5 queen is cool. The rook on c8 is also a very good piece. The e4 rook is once again a nice rook. It's going to g4. Any moment it can go to g4. And our fianchetto bishop, the g7 bishop, is much better than the e3 bishop. Just compare those two bishops. Our bishop is active, attacking the d4 pawn, and white's bishop, it is also a dark squared bishop, but it's much more passive. All it is doing is to defend the d4 pawn. So one piece is happy, the g7 bishop is a really good piece, and the other bishop is just a very passive piece on e3. And in general, white's pieces are passive because he has to pay attention to defending his pawns. That's the problem when suddenly you have structural weaknesses like the d4 pawn, the b2 pawn, the a5 pawn, that those pawns can be hanging, and you have to pay attention to protecting them. Instead of playing active, taking the initiative, white here in this position just has to defend and defend and defend. And that's because we are controlling the d5 square. We didn't let white push that pawn to d5, to d6 to make that passed pawn be strong. So very important, and you guys did such a good job by saying that yes, we can give up the bishop, but what we cannot give up is the control of the d5 square. So very good. So proud of you. After b5, Kamsky didn't capture on d5, but it doesn't matter. We have that square, so what matters is the square. Rook d1 was played, and bishop c4 because he doesn't even want to let the opponent have this knight d3, knight c5 maneuver. What Karpov was very good at is preventing the opponent's counter chances. He sees a maneuver for white, knight d3, knight c5, because the c5 square for the white knight would be an outpost. It would be a good square for the knight that no pawn can chase away. So that's an outpost. And so he says, I don't care about giving up the bishop, but I will not let you have a good piece on c5. So he simply plays bishop c4 in order to avoid knight d3, knight c5. Of course, h5 is always a possibility, but we have discussed that nothing happens to black's king. And if knight d3, as I said, we will simply capture, and this is the position we want. We will have the queen on d5, and these very good pieces, the rooks, the queen on d5, the bishop on g7, so black's pieces are much better than white's pieces. So simple, isn't it? Simple. After rook ac1, he played h6. He prevents h5. He even takes a moment, a step, a little move to prevent h5, because now after h5 he could go g5 and win a piece, because f4 will be a fork. So white even lost this last opportunity of attacking, well, trying to attack with h5. After h6, there's no h5 anymore, and it's just so sad for white that he has no counterplay at all. Rook c3 was played, and after b4, gaining more space on the queen side and preparing a possible queen b5 move so that this a5 pawn will be hanging. Rook c6. He wants to exchange rooks on the c5 because after rook c2, white was planning to double rooks on the c5. And as I said, Karpov is an expert on preventing the opponent's counterplay. So he already knew that white was playing for rook d c1, and after bishop b5, he just exchanges one rook, whether king h2, that's what happened in the game, or rook c6, bishop c6, doesn't matter. And yes, you might wonder, but what about d5? We wanted to prevent d5. Yes, but in this position, things have changed. We have this pawn on b4, and if white pushes d5, it means that it opens the diagonal for our bishop. Suddenly the g7 bishop is attacking the b2 pawn, the a5 pawn is also weak, and this d5 pawn is not very stable. It cannot be pushed to d6, and suddenly all the white pawns, a5, b2, d5 pawn, will be in the air. So yes, sometimes white can go d5, but it's not the end of the world if it means that our bishop will be active. And just by playing d5, it doesn't mean that white suddenly has counterplay if he cannot push the pawn further. So the d5 pawn will be hanging in many positions. The b2 pawn is hanging. The a5 pawn will be hanging. This position is lost for white. It doesn't matter that he managed to push the pawn one square ahead. Doesn't solve his problems. Kamsky went for king h2, but after king h7, but Karpov just plays very safe. He puts the king on h7 and he says, okay, later, doesn't matter if it takes me 10, 20 or 30 moves, but he will win the endgame. So after these exchanges and rook c4, bishop f4 was played, and this is such an annoying move because he could have captured the pawn already with bishop d4. I told you that this pawn will be hanging at some point. This is just a pawn up for black. But bishop f8 is an even stronger move because after bishop d6, we will not have a pawn up, but what we will have is a complete control of the position. Let me show you what I mean. For instance, let's say rook c2, bishop d6. Look at those bishops. It's just horrible. Or in case of, well, it was the same with rook c1, but here I can show you a different line with queen a4. What I mean is that with the bishop on d6, the knight cannot move away from f4. If the knight cannot move, the queen from g3 cannot move. If those pieces cannot move, then the bishop from e3 cannot move either. So those three pieces are frozen. They are paralyzed just because black played this bishop f8, bishop d6 maneuver. So sometimes instead of grabbing material, you might think that, okay, I could have a pawn up, or I could paralyze three pieces of the opponent. And if you paralyze three pieces of the opponent, what remains is one single rook. So white can only move his rook in this position. That's horrible, isn't it? He cannot move the queen because he would lose it immediately thanks to this discovered attack. So this position is just lost for white because he cannot move any of his pieces. That's why this bishop f8 move was so strong. White tried to get out of the pin playing knight d3, and after, well, queen e6 was played, but if Karpov played queen d5 immediately, the game would have been over right in that moment, because what is the threat after queen d5? Just tell me very quickly. I will not even put the time to think image on the screen because I'm sure that you can spot the threats. What are we threatening after queen d5? We are threatening rook g4, and we are also threatening queen c4, and we are also threatening rook h4, all those moves. So do you think that white can prevent three big threats at the same time. The hanging rook, the rook g4 attack on g2, rook takes h4, and the rook cannot be captured because it's mate on g2. No, of course he cannot. So queen d5 would have won the game on the spot. There's no way of defending here. Let me just, I don't know what even how to demonstrate it because every move loses. Let's try knight e5, maybe protecting the rook and threatening the c6 bishop, but this is just bad because of rook takes e5. So at the end, doesn't matter that white can go rook takes c6 too. We go rook e3 and this is a piece up. So even these kind of tactics don't work for white. And if he moves the rook, this is what you guys said, either rook g4 or rook takes h4. I prefer because it's a check. So then we can go rook g4 next move. And it's just really sad. Or bishop d6 first and then rook g4. The position is completely lost. So I think we don't even need to discuss this game any further because after queen d5, it's just clearly completely lost for white. Too many threats at the same time. But what we should learn from this game is, first of all, we want queen b6 and bishop d7, not capturing neither on d4 nor on b2. Don't be greedy. If your pieces are undeveloped, don't capture the pawn, neither on d4 nor on b2. It's usually just a move that helps white because white wants to take the initiative, white wants to attack. And even if we are not losing the queen, like in case of queen b2, we were losing the queen, but if we capture on d4, we are not losing the queen, we are not losing a piece, but what we lose is time. And time is precious in chess. You need to develop your pieces first. You need to have as many active pieces as possible, and then you might take a pawn. Don't do it the other way around because you need to have pieces playing. Doesn't matter if you have a pawn up, why your pieces are not playing. A rook on a8, a bishop on c8, those are like two pieces down. So you don't want to be a piece or two pieces down. You want to develop your pieces and then you might capture a pawn. That was the first thing we had to learn from this game. Secondly, this maneuver. We went to d8 with the a rook because we want to keep this f rook here protecting the f7 pawn. And after this capture on f6, doesn't matter that white was threatening on a7, g6 is good because the bishop on f6 will protect the dark squares. And this maneuver, this is what I want you to remember from this game. Knight e7, 2-in-1 move. We improve the knight and the bishop at the same time. So the knight can jump to either to d5 or to f5 and the bishop will go to c6. So this is the way you should play against the isolated pawn. And we will see one more game before our time is up, which is another plan. So remember this knight maneuver, knight e7, knight f5, and after knight e7, bishop c6, we have the rook on the d5, the bishop on c6, the knight going to f5, the fianchetto bishop after g6, bishop g7. Another idea that you should know when you play against the isolated pawn is from this Nabati Nakamura game from last year, from Gibraltar. This was the Alapin, the Sicilian defense, and we will soon reach the position I want to talk about because this is all theory. But first of all, knight b4, attacking the d3 bishop, and this knight can go to d5 later on. You know that that square is a cool place for black's pieces, so knight b4, knight d5 is a very typical maneuver playing against the isolated pawn. Of course, white will never give up the bishop. You know with white that you should keep this bishop. But still, it's good to attack it because we win a tempo for our maneuver. And after b6, here, black will fianchetto his bishop. So this is a different setup. It also depends on how your opponent plays. So you cannot always play like Karpov played. You cannot always go for queen b6, knight e7, bishop c6, then knight f5. Sometimes you have to alter your plan depending on how the opponent plays. So here, this is a different way, a different setup. Please learn this as well because it depends on the position which one you can apply. So we went knight b4, then b6. We will fianchetto our bishop. That's a good bishop. And after knight e5, rook c8. Now we will not have the rook on d8, but we go rook c8. And soon we will start trading pieces because you know that when you play against the isolated pawn, you want to play an endgame. So let's trade pieces. Let's go and exchange the bishop on g5. Let's trade pieces on d5. The more pieces we exchange, the better. So after knight fd5, we want to exchange pieces. We say that do something about the g5 bishop. And here, this is a very, very important moment. Queen h5. Once again, threatening mate. This is so typical that you have to prevent mate when playing against the isolated pawn. What shall we do? You have 4 options. Okay, one we will clearly not discuss. Knight f6 is obviously a losing move because the knight will be eliminated and then we are mated on h7. Let's not blunder. But after queen h5, you have 3 options. You can go h6, you can go g6, or you can go f5. Think about it and tell me which pawn would you push in order to avoid the mate on h7. All right, I've seen already the correct answer and you all chose f5. Congratulations to all of you. We'll see why not h6 and why not g6 because those moves are losing moves. Unfortunately, you have to be very careful protecting your king, and in this position, the only good move was f5. So congratulations guys for choosing f5. Now we will see why not h6 and why not g6. If black goes h6, now this is the moment when you should change how to play with the isolated pawn. We know that we should attack. Sometimes you can just sacrifice just to eliminate pawns in front of the opponent's king. So in this position, if you are playing with the white pieces, you will definitely go bishop takes h6. Let's eliminate that pawn because after g takes, queen takes, once again we are threatening queen h7 mate. And here f5 is not the same as in the starting position because after queen e6 check, king h8, we can give a check again. With these checks, we will simply place the queen in the square where we want. So these checks are very useful. And when we have the queen where we wanted to have it here on g6. After bishop f5, we are threatening queen h7 mate once again. And there's just no good way of preventing it because queen h7 is the threat, but also knight f7 check. We have sacrificed a piece for 3 pawns. It's not even 3 pawns, 4 pawns. Sorry, I cannot count. So we have more than enough material for the piece, and at the same time we will regain material because black has to give up his rook for the bishop if he doesn't want to get mated, or if he goes knight f6, then it will be just, well, you can go knight f7, but there's even stronger bishop e6. Oh. And this is mate, actually. So after bishop takes f5, black has to go for rook f5, queen f5, and now we have a rook and 4 pawns for 2 pieces. So we even have material advantage, plus we are threatening knight f7 check, knight g6 check, queen h5. The rook can go to e6 after the knight jump. So the attack goes on, and we even have more material. So that's a lost position for black. That's all because h6 is bad. There are no defending pieces around black's king, so you have to be very careful playing with black these positions because it can be lost in just a couple of moves. After queen h5, if you make a mistake, it's all over because it's about your king. It's not about losing a pawn. It's not about getting into a worse endgame. It's about your king. If you make a mistake protecting your king, then it's over. There's no other chance. You cannot survive if you make a mistake in the defense of your king. So h6 is a bad move. But what about g6? That's not so obvious, I think. After g6, once again, turn on your how to play with the isolated pawn mind and attack with white. How to attack here? It's once again sacrifice. Yes, we can capture on g6, and it will take two pieces. We will sacrifice two pieces, but we will capture all those pawns. Now there are no pawns protecting black's king. First of all, it's good to know when you sacrifice that you always have a draw if you want. So I think everybody is more relaxed about sacrificing material when you know that in worst case it's a draw. In worst case you give perpetual check. But of course we don't want a draw, we want to win. After king h8 you can go queen h5 check and then rook takes e6. This is not so obvious that this would be losing, but I can tell you that since there are no pawns in front of black's king and no defending pieces, because the only piece that's near, that's the f8 rook and it's not protecting anything, and the e7 bishop, well, yeah, this bishop is hanging, but it doesn't matter because the queen and the rook will give mate or win more materials after rook g6, king f7, rook g5, and it will be a mate in a few moves. The king cannot hide anywhere, so believe me, this leads to mate. I can show you a few moves, but actually there's just no shelter for black. So if he goes to d6, let's try to hide on d6, then even the knight comes into play. And of course you have to calculate this, but you can see in this position, even if you cannot calculate it till the very end, even if you cannot calculate it till mate, that a king in the middle of the board or on the king side without pawns in front of it is just doomed to death. It will get mated. You cannot hide this king anywhere. All the black pieces are on the 8th rank and the minor pieces are on b4, d5, b7, not helping the king at all. Maybe the only piece that could help a bit is this d5 knight, but it's not enough. So the black king cannot hide anywhere, and after rook e1 it will be a mate. So after g6, we sacrifice two pieces on g6, a few checks, and rook e6, threatening rook g6 check. He could try playing bishop f6, that's true, but after queen g6 check, and now even the other rook comes, you know that the more attacking pieces the better. It wasn't easy, I know. We had to sacrifice two pieces for this attack, but we have four pawns and a lot of counterplay, a lot of it's not even counterplay. White is better. White is almost winning because winning. White has an advantage. I don't even know how to put it, but it's very unlikely that black survives this attack because we have this queen on g6, the bishop on g5, the rook on e6, and with our last move, this was a very important move. The rook comes to e4 and from e4 to h4, and that would be a mate. So black has to give up material. If he goes bishop g5, then once again he will be mated. Of course you cannot survive this position, it's mate. And since he cannot capture the bishop, he can try to bring his rook on the 7th rank to cover his king, but then the 8th rank will be weak. So g6 was also a losing move. It was less obvious, and white had to be brave to sacrifice two pieces. But as I said, when you see that you have at least a draw, then yes, go for the sacrifice. You have nothing to lose. In worst case, you give a perpetual check. You always have a draw in your hand. And you can try to give mate. So after queen h5, rook e6, you will still have a perpetual check. So in the moment you stop believing in your position, like after bishop f6, if you don't believe in this position, you can go for the draw, because bishop g7 is never a move. The queen would be hanging, so it's always a perpetual. That's why it's good to sacrifice in positions where you have at least perpetual check. You have nothing to risk. You always have at least a draw, and you can play for a win too. But let's go back to our critical moment. h6 was losing, g6 was losing, and the only good move, and this is the move you have to learn from this game, is f5, and you all figured it out. It has its drawbacks. The drawback is that now the e6 pawn will be weak. It's a backward pawn, and the e5 square is now an outpost for white's knight. We cannot chase that knight away from e5. But it has advantages as well. Suddenly the b1 bishop is not attacking at all. We have cut the diagonal of that bishop. We also have gained some space on the king side, and that's good when your king is under attack to have some more space. But the point is that there's no sacrifice. Black is completely safe. There's no bishop takes f5 like in the other positions. There was always a sacrifice. The pawn on f5 can never be captured, so it's very safe to play f5. And now white is forced to do something about the g5 bishop. He either has to capture on e7, and that's something that we want. We want to trade pieces, or what the opponent played, bishop d2, trying to keep the bishop, but that means that this bishop on d2 is more passive, so white is not attacking anymore. After knight c6, the pawn is hanging this. You know that the isolated pawn can be weak, and now it's hanging on d4. Knight c6, rook c6, of course we protect the e6 pawn. You see that it's a weak pawn, but this is not the only weak pawn in the position. The d4 pawn is also weak, so both players have a weakness, a structural weakness in this position. The question is which pawn will be weaker. After a3, Nakamura went for knight c3 because after b takes, the a3 pawn is hanging, so white had to play bishop c3, and this is a position similar to the Karpov game. The d5 square is always so important. So after having traded some minor pieces, we can have the queen on d5. It's such a powerful queen on d5, attacking in every possible direction. Queen side, king side, black's camp, white's camp. We are threatening to capture on c3 and give mate on g2. That's a huge threat, so white has to do something about it. And if he goes f3 to block the diagonal, we can simply play bishop f6. The pawn is hanging on d4. We will bring the rook to d8 or to c8. White pieces. Black's pieces are much better. I have a color. This queen, the bishop, rook, bishop, this rook on d8 or c8. It's such a good position for black because we have a powerful queen on d5. Compare it to the white queen. It's on h5. It seems like it's attacking our king, but what piece is helping the white king? What piece, I will put it again, what piece is helping the white queen? One single queen on h5 will not give mate. And if there's no bishop helping that queen, we have blocked that bishop. So there's no threat on h7, and this bishop is not attacking either. So white is not attacking here. It is black who has the initiative. After queen d5, the opponent played queen f3. But now this pawn structure is just horrible for white. And Nakamura went on to win the game a few moves later because, well, few moves. It took him some moves, but this endgame is just so superior because white's pawn structure is much worse. Let me just show you a few moves that happened. The f3 pawn is hanging now. So white decided to give up that pawn, but it's just so bad. He could have just played bishop d5, for instance, and it's a pawn up. The f3 pawn is hanging. The h2 pawn will be hanging too later. We can go bishop d6, rook h6, anything. This position is just completely, well, not completely, but it's much better for black because even after losing the d pawn, white's pawn structure hasn't improved. He gave up the pawn because in this position he will lose something anyway. You cannot protect everything. Let's just say bishop e2, trying to keep this pawn under control, protected. Rook g6, and whether king f1, bishop d6, Now the h2 pawn is hanging, or if king h1, he can go bishop g5, and our plan is to go bishop f4 and then rook h6. So in every position, white is losing at least one pawn, and it's not only about the pawn. White's king is still weak. Even without queens, this king is weak because of the pawn structure. So this pawn structure is horrible. Doubled pawns, isolated doubled pawns. The h2 pawn is also separated from everything, and the d4 pawn is still an isolated pawn. This is just a very, very bad position for white. And it all happened because after queen h5, okay, first of all, we went for this knight b4 maneuver and b6, fianchetting the bishop, bishop b7, and then rook c8, having the c file for our rook, and knight fd5 because we want to trade pieces. And this was the critical moment in the game. After queen h5, you should be very careful. Whenever your king is under attack, make sure that you calculate everything. Take into account the possible sacrifices because h6 was a losing move, g6 was a bad move. The only good move was f5. And that's a move that has its drawbacks and its advantages too. So remember this move f5. In many positions we can go for f5. It gives up the e5 square and our e6 pawn will be weak, but at the same time the b1 bishop is much worse. Well, it's not attacking, that's for sure. It's not a horrible piece, but it's not attacking. And the d4 pawn is weak too, so if we can get a position like what happened in the game, queen d5, the e6 pawn is very well protected here, and the d4 pawn is, well, it's weaker than the e6 pawn. And at the same time, when we have this square on d5 for whether our knight, our bishop, or the queen, it's always a great square for a black piece. You know that that's the square where you should have a piece. It's just a perfect square. It's an outpost for black pieces. I hope that I could help you in knowing what you should do against the isolated pawn. You should remember the knight maneuver from Karpov's game, the knight e7 maneuver, then playing bishop c6 and knight f5. And you should also remember that you can play with f5 when your king is under attack. Don't blunder with g6 or h6. I will see you in less than an hour because at 8:30 we have a thematic tournament on this topic, and the position that we will practice is one of the positions we have just seen. So I hope that you paid attention because you will have to practice that position. I will not tell you which game. I will not tell you whether it's Karpov's game or Nakamura's game, but you will have to practice one of these positions in our thematic tournament. I will copy you the link once again where you can sign up for the tournament. It's here. I'll be live once again in about 45 minutes. I'll be here, yeah, from about 8:15 Central European Time, 8:20. So I can give you some more tips before the tournament begins. Make sure that you listen to me before the tournament. I will give you some advice on the position, what you can expect. And the tournament will begin exactly at 8:30. So make sure that you are here before then 8:30. You should sign up before then 8:30. If not, you cannot participate. If I were you, I would sign up right now and then come back a bit earlier than 8:30. So I will see you in about 40-50 minutes. And I hope that you will enjoy the tournament. I'll be watching and I will see whether you learned everything that we have discussed today. I hope that now you are more comfortable playing the isolated pawn. Whether it's with the isolated pawn, you are playing with the isolated pawn or against it, but I'm sure that you know a lot more about this pawn structure by now. So there's everything that you need to know. You can win this tournament, you can practice this. Actually, it's not about winning the tournament. It's of course always nice to win a tournament, but it's more about practicing that we have what we have learned, because without practicing, theory is not enough. You have to put your knowledge into practice. If not, it won't be enough. You need to, I've said it so many times, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but you need to practice. It's all I want to say. So make sure that you sign up for the training tournament. We make these tournaments for you guys so that you can feel more comfortable about practicing what we have learned, because if you just play blitz with your friends, it's not sure that it will be the isolated pawn structure. So if you want to practice what you learned from me, you should sign up for this tournament where the starting position will be an isolated pawn structure, one of the positions from today's games. Which one it will be? You will see that very soon in 50 minutes, 55 minutes. See you in less than an hour. I'll be here watching your games, commenting live on your games. Make sure that you sign up for the tournament, and I will see you very shortly. Sign up for the tournament. Bye.